Homeless Network News is back to inform the twin. HNN re-begins. Zip-zop-zap it again. We bring in actual stories, real folks, factual exploratory. We track, we scope even beyond the MM territory. Network news, hard-hitting on a beat. Various points of view, journalistic whipping it from the street. So have your seat, cause it's time to bring more issues to light, cause that's what we do. Z newsing it up right. Yo, flow, intro to HNN crew. HNN crew. HNN crew. HNN crew. HNN, back again, here we grow, back in the know, back with the show where packs will flow, just rock and roll this episode of HNN, back again, here we grow, back in the know, back with the show where packs will flow, just rock and roll this episode of HNN, back again, here we grow, back in the know, back with the show where packs will flow, just rock and roll this episode. Hello, 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 everybody. A hearty welcome to America and to our viewers. Welcome to zAmya's Homeless Network News. Now, I'm your host, Corey Walton, coming to you live from zAmya's world headquarters in downtown Minneapolis. Now, the title of this week's episode is More Questions? Any Answers? And the sponsor for this week's episode is United Renters for Justice. Now, based in Minneapolis, United Renters works for permanently affordable democratic housing and structural changes. Now, this great organization does this through tenant unions, rent stabilization, stronger enforcement of renter protections, and a cooperatively owned housing. Now, to learn more about United Renters, please click on their posting on our Facebook page. A wonderful organization with some great ideas. Now, lots to get to with today's episode. So let's just dive right in with some questions about housing from our participants of our creative workshops. Now, these participants are guests of the St. Paul Dorothy Day Opportunity Center. Talk about thought-provoking. Take a listen for yourself.
Where is the public housing building?
Who knows what that is?
How much does public housing cost?
How come it's called public housing, but nobody really knows where it is? How do the homeless find it?
Who do I ask about the public housing?
Do you have a county worker?
How do you get help fast?
How can you wait in a long line when you need an answer to a crisis that's happening in the moment? Why is this process so hard?
If public housing COVID safe?
How does one get a county worker?
What is a county worker and what do they do?
Can you get help after eviction?
Why do people have to rent instead of own their own houses? Why should you give money to other people to live in your house? Why is it so expensive and why can't we afford it? Why can't the homeless afford it?
What does affordable housing actually mean?
Why does affordable housing seem to be above the average Social Security payment? Why do I have to find a slumlord just to rent?
Does anyone else feel like they've slipped through the cracks and that nobody cares?
Why don't the government get off the butt and help more?
How lost and desperate do you need to be before somebody will help you? How can one of the richest countries in the world have so many people who don't have enough?
If you have more than two children, can they have their own room?
Why in the world would someone keep you from getting housing because your male and female child can't share a room?
Why are there so many agencies that are supposed to help the homeless and people with mental health? Why are there so many, but we can't get to any of them?
Is there even hope for us?
Is there public housing in other states?
Do you feel hopeless every day?
When the heck is something going to change?
How do we get our hope back?
Can the people who've brought us down still restore our faith? Can you give me the tools so I can save myself?
Yes, can you give me the tools so I can save myself? And you can't get the right answers unless you ask the right questions. So do you have any burning questions about housing? Let's hear them. Drop those in our chat box as always. I mean, you'd be surprised at how many people are just pretty much asking the same thing. In the meantime, let's keep this zAmya train moving down the tracks. Now, you ever wonder what an unlawful detainer is? Well, I guess I could sit here and kind of read you a book definition of what it is, but it's too important a term to give you just a dry definition, especially in the context of homelessness. So I got a better idea. I'm going to let a couple of our zAmya friends give you an illustration. So check this out.
Okay, rental agreement. All right, name, got it. Address. So it's kind of weird because like I guess the address I have right now. Okay. Great. Okay. Oh, I really hope I get this apartment. It's so cute. It's just in my price range. Like it'll be a stretch, but I think it's really gonna help. Unlawful detainer. Do I have an unlawful detainer? I don't know what that, I don't know. Unlawful detainer. Do I have an unlawful detainer? Let me see. How do I, well, I guess unlawful is like illegal, like not lawful, and a detainer. That's like being held. Have I been held back or kept somewhere illegally? No, I don't know. But or is the answer yes? I mean, I guess, one time the airplane, the airport, the airlines like kind of messed up, and I was supposed to be on a flight, but I couldn't get on the flight, and so like then I was like, I felt like unlawfully detained at the airport. Like, God, that should be illegal, right? I mean, I had bought a ticket, and but is that what? Why would they need to know? So no, that must not. This is like not something I love to talk about, but I was mugged one time, and that really felt like an unlawful detainer. I guess I'll say no, question mark. I hope this doesn't stop me from getting the apartment.
Actually, an unlawful detainer is an action, and it is required in order to evict a tenant from a rental property. Evict. Whew. An eviction. It says it's a legal process by which a landlord may terminate a tenant. So now we're able to terminate tenants? An unlawful detainer means a landlord wants a tenant to leave their property. So you have to have an unlawful detainer put on you want to evict. Yeah, that's not true all the time. And the landlord may just really want you to get out the unit. So if you don't want an eviction, if you have that option, you don't want an eviction and you don't want an unlawful detainer on your record, you just might want to move. According to Minnesota legislature, as of October 12th, 2021, the eviction ban will only apply to renters who have pending COVID-19 rental assistance applications. So hopefully you get that in. If you're still waiting, by the end of June 1st, you're just going to be out. So be careful, be watchful, because a UD, that's what it's also called. An unlawful detainer is something you definitely don't want to be detained with, because either you will be caught between properties, no one will rent to you, or you'll find one of those landlords that you don't want to rent from. Well, for now, that's what we're talking about. No more being unlawfully detained. Have a beautiful day.
Hope you have a beautiful day too, Annette. So technically, an unlawful detainer is an eviction lawsuit. But wasn't that illustration by Rebecca and Annette so much more clear than that legal jargon? Thanks to my zAmya mates for walking us through one of those concepts in this world of housing that many of us know so little about. And speaking of knowing so little about, now that's never a problem for the host of our next segment. Here to talk a little bit about states' rights that tenants have, let me introduce to you Mr. Finger on the Pulse of the Community, advocate for unity, Mr. Roberto Blood, back for another season of his popular segment, In Focus.
Good evening. My name is Robert Blood. I'm a board and troupe member here at zAmya Theater Project. Today, I'm going to bring you a few of the most important tenant rights you should know. I hope these are helpful. But first off, remember, always check your state and local laws. They change from state to state. These are Minnesota-based tenant rights. First one is evictions. Now, evictions is a legal proceeding. A landlord cannot just come up to you and say, you're gone. He has to have legitimate legal reasons to evict you. If he comes to you and says you're evicted, ask him for why and the reasons in writing. If he continues to force this, tell him it's a legal proceeding. You can evict me through the courts. Be nice, be cordial, and make sure you get everything in writing. The second one, escrow. This is another big problem with repairs done to houses or apartments that people are renting. If the repairs in your house are not being done, I would take pictures with a camera or your phone so they're time and date stamped and submit them to your landlord. If he does not respond, contact an attorney, an escrow attorney, put all your money into an escrow account, which is the courts hold your money until the repairs are done. And after that, the money goes to the landlord and he cannot evict you after you do this. It's called retaliation and is illegal. Now, if you're doing repairs on your house and you're buying stuff, keep receipts. If you're painting, repairing, make sure you take pictures before and after, because doing this work, you should be compensated either with rent off or some other kind of arrangement. Unless it's in your lease that you're required to do this work, you are not required to do it. Now, one more very important one. Entering your house. I know people have a problem with landlords just walking in thinking they can just do this. A landlord must give you 24 hours written notice to enter your apartment. If not, if they do not show up the day they say and they come the next day, you do not have to let them in. They have to give you a 24-hour written notice. If you want any more information on tenant rights in Minnesota, you can go to www.ag.mn.us. And that'll give you a list of all tenant rights and you can read them and they'll describe exactly how to go about doing escrow and evictions. I want to thank you for joining me today. I hope this was helpful and I hope that your home is yours. Thank you and have a great evening.
Thank you so much, Roberto, for that informational segment of In Focus. Always lots of useful information on the topic of homelessness from our host of In Focus, Mr. Roberto Blood. And again, ask those questions, put them in the chat box. Okay, now I got a question for you. When is the last time you've been to a party? And I ain't talking about any old party. I'm talking about a party that means something, a party with a purpose. A party with an aim, with a goal. A party that folks go to with noble objectives in mind. Don't know what I'm talking about yet? Check this out.
Fleeing Jim Crow laws in the South, an estimated 200,000 blacks migrated, seeking a new life of dignity and opportunities they felt that they could get in the North. West Indians, Africans, and African Americans settled in Harlem, New York, and other eastern towns. They were all seeking the promised land, dignity and respect, and hard work and earnings. They soon learned, however, that this was not the promised land. Faced with discrimination, hiked up rent, and low wages, blacks threw rent parties. You may ask, What is a rent party? Well, it's exactly that. Rent parties is a party that you raise money to pay your rent. The rent parties had its origins in Harlem, New York, beginning from the 1920s through the latter 60s. What's the purpose? Well, you need to know. The rent parties were an integral part of establishing the socio-economics, the culture, the politics, and literary greatness. You must understand that rent parties were married to the movement. It was a new movement of African American people doing great things, setting culture, establishing trends that the whole world embraced. And more so, these rent parties provided an avenue for Black tenants to eat, drink, and dance, to have a reprieve from the everyday oppression that they had experienced in the Promised Land. It was pretty rough, people. Well, these rent parties helped to build the Black community while they creatively addressed economic hardship. You want to talk about some organization and survival? These parties were well propped to entertain and become a trend for the whole nation. All right, well, how did I get to go to one of these parties? I'm so glad you asked. You had to be invited. Invitation cards were posted. The great poet and writer Langston Hughes was known to send out these invitations. There were plenty of parties going on. Well, how much did it cost? It cost 25 to 50 cents to attend a rent party. There was a band or a DJ to spin the records, and that's all the DJ did in those days, just spun the records. There was food and there was alcohol. Check this out. There were even waistline parties to determine how much patrons would pay according to their waistline. Entrenched in the Harlem Renaissance period and contributing to the history of the new Negro, many great performances and artists were born out of these parties. There were such greats as Fats Waller, Duke Ellington, Willie the Lion Smith, Lucky Robinson, and James Johnson, who was the father of the Harlem Stride. The rent party ceased as times changed in the Harlem community. Rent sponsors were being robbed, the drug culture went spiraling out of control, violence began to increase, and the age of prohibition had long been gone. By the late 60s, Harlem was a changed place. Have you noticed that some people are still experiencing these same things? Discrimination, inflated rent prices, and low wages even today? Just as a burst of economic survival and growth came out of an oppressed people back in the day of the Harlem Renaissance, it is still possible now, people. Today, we continue to face these housing disparities of yesterday, so, perhaps a rent party or two will do. Peace.
The incredible Marcia Barnes, y'all, with a little history lesson on rent parties. Now, if you didn't know much about those, we were more than happy to bring you a little taste of that traditional practice, at the heart of which is generosity and compassion, because that's what we do. We inform. Now, from one ZAM family member to another. Next up, longtime HNN reporter Greg Tromazak reports on the new rent control measures that were passed in the recent elections in both Minneapolis and St. Paul.
Hello, Minnesota. I'm Greg with Homeless Network NewZ. In Minneapolis and St. Paul, residents have now voted yes for rent control. The amendment authorizes City Council to regulate rents on private residential properties. Rent control initiatives will be into effect in St. Paul in 2022. Minneapolis rent control initiative is still yet to be developed policy. These new policies will create stability for tenants in a tight housing market where the most residents are renters. Low-income renters and people of color will benefit the most from these new policies since they are the most adversely affected by high increases in rent. Rent control policies address racial climate and support economic justice. Rent control will stop rents from spiking and displacing residents. Due to losing jobs and housing during the pandemic, Many renters struggled to pay their rent in 2020. Now that there are no longer any stimulus checks to keep people from falling behind, rent control is a pathway to housing stability. Unfettered profits from developers cause renters to move out, rent to increase, and new unaffordable housing to be built. In addition to rent control, minimum wage jobs and affordable housing are a part of the solution to the housing crisis. We want to thank organizers and activist groups that got together before the November 2nd election to get residents of Minneapolis and St. Paul to vote yes for the amendment. United Renters for Justice, Homeline, social activists, and Homeless Day Coalition were among those who helped build the movement to carry forward the opposition to those wanting to defeat the referendum on rent control. Yes, for rent control ushers in a policy driven by the people. A policy driven by the people is what we voted for. So let us support the ordinance to make housing affordable for all. This has been Greg with HNN. See you next time.
Fantastic segment by our own Greg Traumazak, highlighting those rent controls, a very important topic, by the way, within this concept of homelessness. And not just here, as we've seen rent control measures brought forward for debate in the city of Boston and elsewhere. So it's probably a safe bet that more US cities will probably follow suit. Dun, 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 dun. Okay. Can you guess what time it is? Dun, 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 dun. That's right. You guessed it. It's headline news. Now, this week's installment includes news about squatting. So if you're unfamiliar with the term squatting, you'll definitely want to check out Esther O. and Marvin Howard with this week's edition of Dun, 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 Headline News.
Marvin, what are you doing?
I'm working out. I'm doing my squats.
Okay, well, it's time to do some headlines for our friends out there.
Okay, not a problem. Just 10 more squats.
Our audience is already here. They're watching you squat.
Okay, that's what I got. Okay. And now for the news. Not new news, but the same old news.
Okay, that was kind of lame, but here we go with the headlines. Twin Cities housing shortage is worst in nation.
The Twin Cities is faring the worst amid a national housing shortage that could last years.
Twin Cities housing shortage surpasses that of Los Angeles, Seattle, and Denver, cities that epitomize the phrase high cost of living. Data shows that only 4.6% of for sale and rental housing in the Twin Cities metro was available last year.
The median sales price also broke a record by exceeding $350,000 this summer. Not what I would call affordable by any means. Oh my God. Looking for housing is more exhausting than doing these squats.
The housing crisis is only going to get crazier as the eviction moratorium ends. The clock is running out for many Minnesotans facing rising housing instability.
More than 40% of renter households in the United States are going to experience a rental shortfall during the COVID-19 crisis, with just under 12 million facing eviction over the next 4 months alone. Minnesota estimates are among the highest at 50% or greater.
The eviction moratorium and squatters' rights.
Squatters' rights? Wait, why do I need rights? I need a right to squat?
Marvin, squatters' rights, like for people who squat?
Like me, I'm squatting.
Just do your squats and pay attention to the headlines, please. Squatters' rights
Thank you.
in the eviction moratorium. The eviction moratorium has one primary effect on squatters' rights: attention. The law might not change, but the widespread ban on evictions has made it more common than ever for a tenant to live on a property without paying rent, an act traditionally reserved for squatters.
Reserved for squatters?
Yeah, just stop your squatting and read this definition of a squatter.
A squatter is someone who is occupying the property of another person without authority or permission, with the intent of staying or living there. Oh, that type of squatter.
The U.S. has quite a history of squatting.
Squatting, lifting the heavy burden to evict unwanted company.
Squatting was initially encouraged by the United States government. During the early 1800s, squatting was a means to bolster land settlement in the western part of the country. Statutes referred to as squatters' rights provided incentives to squatters by granting preemptive rights to them over others seeking to purchase the land.
The Federal Homesteading Act of 1862 supported squatting on public tracts of land. This act allowed a squatter to acquire legal title to the land when the squatter was successful in inhabiting and cultivating the land.
Although squatting is no longer encouraged nor sanctioned in this country,
is anything free sanctioned in the United States?
There are some very inspiring stories about squats in the 20th century. One of the most famous squats in the world, C Squat.
In 1989, a rundown tenement building on the Lower East Side of New York City, lacking stairs and landings where apartments were connected by a series of ladders, was taken over by a group of squatters. The squatters repaired the building, including making an open venue for performers in the basement. C Squat even had an indoor skate park by the time squatters were done with it.
In 2002, squatters started the process of making themselves legal owners of C Squat. And in 2015, C Squat became a legal living co-op. This was one big step for squatters everywhere.
One small step for rundown buildings in New York City.
Then there's the squat at Notara 26. In the radical neighborhood of Exarchia, Athens, a 5-story house has been occupied to provide living quarters for refugees.
Notara 26 has sheltered thousands of refugees.
And there's the story of Christiana, where I visited in 1985 and often dream about returning to. Denmark's Freetown Christiana hangs on to Seoul. A refuge for anarchists, hippies, and artists, Denmark's Freetown Christiana turns 50 this fall.
Although it hasn't completely avoided the encroachment of modernity and capitalism, its soul remains intact.
Freetown Christiana has its own unique currency, flag, system of transport, rules and government, post office, and restaurants and stores. Christiana occupies some of the most valuable real estate in Copenhagen, but the residents of this micronation eventually bought all 85 acres of land from the Danish government through collective shares owned by the community as a whole. Freetown was originally an abandoned military base.
Ah, like Fort Snelling.
Which squatters began using as their communal dwelling in 1971. Originally, the inhabitants were anarchists, but that approach eventually gave way to the self-governance applied by the community today. And Fort Snelling has been taken over by developers. An unfortunate story for another time. But Minneapolis has its own squatting history.
Up and out of poverty now. Opened a chapter in Minneapolis in April 1990 and occupied the vacant Nicolette Hotel in downtown. A month later, they had occupied 4 vacant houses in a former Washburn Crosby mill building.
While HUD was not sympathetic, Minneapolis leaders were responsive to up and out of poverty's demands. By the end of May 1990, the Minneapolis Community Development Agency, otherwise known as MCDA, gave up and out access to a duplex on Columbus Avenue South. They then occupied the Kate Dunwoody residence in downtown. The building was owned by the University of St. Thomas and slated to become offices for the downtown campus. At the urging of activists, the city and St. Thomas agreed to convert the building into a low-income hotel instead. Although the plan met with resistance from business leaders who thought the hotel would scare away customers, the Dunwoody building was opened as the Exodus Hotel, where several of our zAmya troupe members have called home at one time or another. You ever stayed there?
No, I never did. I know I tried to apply, but at that time I, moved to St. Paul. Here's a headline about an individual squatter who wanted a little more luxury than Exodus. Squatter living in Florida mansion legally.
Andre Barbosa, aka Loki Boy, named after the Norse god of mischief, is living the dream. The 23-year-old Brazilian has been crashing at a vacant mansion in Boca Raton, Florida for free. And it's all legal.
Using an obscure Florida real estate law to stake his claim on the foreclosed waterside property, Barbosa is legit squatting. The police can't move him. The situation is driving his neighbors crazy. This is a very upsetting thing. Last week, I went to the Bank of America and asked to see the person in charge of mortgages. I told them I am prepared to buy this house. They haven't even called back.
Loki Boy has posted a notice in the front window naming him as a living beneficiary to the divine estate being superior of commerce and usury.
And here's a not so amusing story. After foreclosure, woman breaks back into her home to squat.
After 2 years of negotiations with Wells Fargo, Tanya Dennis, a former East Bay school principal, ended up in foreclosure.
Tanya called a locksmith who helped her break into her South Berkeley home of 27 years.
Quoting Tanya, "These banks got billions of dollars of our money. We can't afford to be complacent."
With 5 times as many vacant homes as homeless people in the US today, a new wave of squatters.
Just as likely to be hard-hit families as young activists making a political statement
is moving into vacant foreclosed properties in cities like Chicago, New York, and Minneapolis.
With more than 1 billion people worldwide now living in informal settlements, squatters' communities are among the primary creators of housing in the developing world. Now, in the context of a global foreclosure crisis, a squatters' movement is emerging across the developed world to claim otherwise vacant buildings as homes.
Minneapolis still battling against vacant properties, even in housing shortage.
Hundreds of houses sit vacant and boarded in Minneapolis, some for years.
Since squatting has a bad rap in Minnesota and it's hard to do legally, these days, we're not going to advocate for it. Exactly. Let's just say it's time for squatting. And that's the news. Not new news, but the same old news. I'm doing my jumping jacks.
All right, Marvin. See you later.
Great headline news segment with some fun information on squatting. I love that headline news. Now, unfortunately, that brings us to the conclusion of this episode of Homeless Network News. Yes, I know that went fast, but we have reached the end of this edition of HNN. But before we go, we'd like to thank our entire ZAM family. You, our viewers, our ZAM-tastic directors, Esther O and K Flo, zAmya director, Moran, AKA Junior, and a warm thanks to all of my zAmya troop mates for bringing you such informative, incredible segments in this week's show. And a special heartfelt thanks to our sponsor, Minneapolis-based United Renters for Justice. Again, to learn more about United Renters, click on their posting on our Facebook page. And while you're there, sign up for our quarterly Z newsletter. Our mid-November issue just dropped. And for all the latest, you can also click on the events tab on our Facebook page. And while you're there, don't forget to hit like. But in the meantime, we'll see all of you on our next episode of Homeless Network News.